Welcome to the Commercial Real Estate Investing from A to Z podcast. I'm your host, Steph Boldrini. We provide straightforward information by bringing excellent guests with real-world experience in all topics related to commercial real estate investing. And in today's episode, we are covering what is happening in the retail space right at this moment, given the interest rate hikes. Are national tenants slowing down on their leases? And what should you keep in mind when negotiating a lease in today's environment? We are chatting with James Chung. He is the founder of the Econic company. He is a veteran in the leasing space industry with over 20 years of experience. Here we go. James, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm super excited and thankful that you are here because you were one of the very first people that said yes to coming on to this podcast when we didn't have many listeners at all. And it was very generous of you, given your extremely busy schedule. So first, thank you so much. But why don't you start by telling us a little bit about you?
Of course. Well, thank you for the opportunity and happy to do it. We started this company in March of 21, which I think a lot of people questioned at the time. I left Cushman & Wakefield after a very happy career with them, close to 20 years, and decided to be an advocate for my arguably second half of my career and try to curate and be purposeful with how I wanted to participate in the industry. It's been a very humbling journey in a positive way. All my clients, when given notice, were gracious enough to want to come. And we do a lot of institutional work, both on the tenant side and the agency side, and have been off to the races since day one. We control a little bit over 19 million square feet in the greater Bay Area and work with over 100 national and regional tenants, from big box tenants down to shop tenants. So we've remained very active. The business continues to grow. We are a company of 9 currently, but are looking to grow, not to grow quantitatively or with the purpose of growing quantitatively, but more qualitatively. So we really hold dear to our hearts, our ethos and our standard. And it's something that if we find people who share that, we explore opportunities to potentially bring them in as partners.
That's fantastic. Congratulations. Just in a year and a half, accomplishing all of that. That is incredible.
Thank you.
So let's jump into, I want to do a series right now because things are changing and I believe sellers are starting to understand that, but the whole industry is going to be changing in the next year and two, potentially. So are you seeing that right now in California, the Bay Area in particular? What is the state right now of retail here and leasing with these large triple net tenants?
I would say the market from a velocity point has actually stayed pretty high. And I think that would be very shocking for people to hear, especially coming out of COVID. However, what was interesting is that we found that, like what happened during the financial crisis in 08 and arguably, during COVID, the Bay Area, because of its fundamentals, is usually the last to fail and first to recover. Mm-hmm. And because the barrier to entry has always been so high, that a lot of national tenants and local tenants, when they see opportunities that were never available historically come available, there becomes, again, a classic supply and demand situation where the opportunities, unfortunately, are less than those in demand. So we've actually seen overall in the better shopping center environments, and when I say that, I mean strong neighborhood centers with grocery anchors, well-positioned power centers. There has been really almost an increase in demand for those opportunities, especially for second gen food space. So there has been a lift, believe it or not, in occupancy costs for those premier opportunities. Having said that, what we've also seen, which has actually never happened in arguably the 20 years I've been in the business, is the influx of inventory in the larger format size. And when I say that, I mean box space, call it from 10 to 100,000 square feet. Because there were so few opportunities before, there was always an incredible demand because, again, the pool of tenants exceeded the opportunities. However, we've seen a shift, especially in the last 2 years since COVID, where there has been an influx again in inventory in that larger format space that now does not have the pool of tenants that were once looking. And so when I say that, I mean by cinemas, it could be large format fitness, it could be large format furniture. There just hasn't been a demand like there was in yesteryear for that type of space.
And so what do you think the plan will be for that kind of space? I know there has been some talk about potentially residential. Do you think the cities are open to that? What do you think is going to happen to those spaces?
That's a great question. What we have seen along those lines are I would say a lot of alternative uses that are being proposed and introduced. So we have seen again things like large format medical and enter into retail environments where traditionally they would have never done so. We've seen industries like auto want to pivot to more traditional retail environments rather than stay in like an auto row environment. With the onset of all the EV, cars coming into the market, there are so many new brands that are even looking for showrooms and even sales centers and or service centers. But what's great about that new segment is that they do not expose the projects to hazardous materials because they're not changing oil, they're not fixing engines, they're fixing batteries, right? Ultimately, at the end of the day. So really, it's evolving and it's going to continue to evolve. But I would say that my guess is that there will be a return of that demand in the larger format sector sooner than later. I think just out of COVID, people are rethinking their execution plans and sizes. And then really that trend started pre-COVID as we saw a lot of what we called right sizing, and those that realized they didn't need as much space as they thought. But again, as that continues to evolve, I think at some point in the near term, we will see a return of a lot of those tenants back into that larger format space.
So to clarify, you see these different types of tenants, not the tenants that left, right? Like Sears and things like that.
No, I don't think it's going to be the legacy tenants like the Sears and JCPenney's of the world. But again, it's going to be an evolution of that. So there could be tenants that may pivot and pursue larger opportunities for different verticals of their company. And whether that's companies like Amazon or whether that's companies like larger format grocery stores that are creating, these hybrid food hall grocery store environments. So it's just a constantly changing environment and ecosystem, which truthfully keeps it exciting. But I would tell you overall though, on a national basis, the vacancy rate is just a hair under 6%. So we're looking at about a 5.9 vacancy rate nationally. But in metros like San Jose and San Francisco, they're lower than that. So we're looking at about 5.5% in San Francisco proper, which before pre-COVID was one of the lowest in the nation, hovering closer to 3%. So there's been obviously a influx of inventory in that environment, and I'll go into that in more detail in a minute. But in San Jose, it's actually down to 4.3%. And that is, I think, more of a reflection because not only the San Jose major metro is actually much more inclusive of a larger trade area. So while we do have a traditional downtown, it's really made up of more of communities around that downtown that are in the form of more traditional retail environments. And when I say that, I mean, again, those power centers and grocery anchored shopping centers where people continue to obviously spend money. But in San Francisco in particular, and in San Jose, truthfully, in Silicon Valley and really all over, I think the headlines that everyone read every day are really impacting the rebound and return of retail again in those really more daytime centric environments. And when I say that, I mean downtown San Francisco, downtown San Jose. In fact, in downtown San Francisco, I think the office market is still heading towards a trough before they go back the other direction. And when I say that, I
Mm-hmm.
mean, and I say that because there's 1,300 leases that are coming due in 2024.
Wow.
And and so while people are not even at back in the office full time yet, I think a lot of companies there are rethinking, how they are going to house their employees, and more importantly, where. And I don't think the headlines, even in the last week, with Amazon layoffs, with Meta layoffs, and companies like that significantly slashing their workforce, that is only going to reduce, obviously, their requirement and also require them to rethink even how they're utilizing their existing environments.
I was reading that office vacancy in San Francisco is 25% right now. So I personally have been gone from San Francisco since April, and I literally just came back. It's a little bit ghosty where all these companies were. And I know that you are leasing mainly more in the South Bay area where there's more suburban. So I'm glad to hear it's not all doom and gloom.
Well,
And
actually, our company, believe it or not, while we are positioned here, retail is a little bit more driven geographically than it is by market. And when I
mm-hmm.
say that is that we have actually coverage all throughout the 9 Bay Area counties. So
Oh
I mean,
wow.
I see, yeah, so we have projects as far north as Santa Rosa, all over the East Bay, South Bay Peninsula. But again, when we do our tenant rollouts, we're rolling them out all throughout the 9 Bay Area counties. So we're touching a lot of geographies. But the Bay Area, unlike office or industrial, where a lot of brokers focus on a submarket, retail is really more driven, by intersections and by
Mm-hmm.
shopping center opportunities than it is, by, call it, working just in the South Bay.
Right. No, I'm very happy to hear that. Surprised and happy. What do you think owners should be doing to prepare for the next couple of years? You did mention that leases are still very competitive. Do you think they might go down a little bit? Price per square foot? What are your thoughts there in preparation for the next 2 years?
In preparation, I think it's important to think long term, not short term. And the knee jerk reaction with the current headwinds of inflation and interest rates rising is to transact differently. And while inflation is 100% real and CPI is obviously at an all time rate, where a lot of landlords were reacting by trying to be hyper aggressive, like with their annual increases, redefining how transactions are put together. And while there is merit to that and it does need to evolve, I think, again, it's really about also securing a tenant today, for the next 10, 20 years and working in partnership with them in finding a solution for a healthy health ratio and occupancy cost for that tenant. And so again, while that description doesn't, it's not a one size fits all. Transaction, the complexion of a transaction for a small restaurant tenant versus a 50,000 foot box tenant are completely different. Overall, though, again, it's planning for the next 10, 20 years and not the next 5 years. And the challenge is too, though, while everybody's facing inflation, it is very difficult to underwrite the uncertainty of the future. And so while the question came from you about how property owners should prepare for that, that same question could also be applied to the tenants. So it's really about finding that middle ground to make sure that it's also fair to the landlords from the tenants, that again, how the transactions are created, and especially when it comes to how you're defining, let's say on an option, how fair market value is determined and what that floor and ceiling should be, right? At the end of the day, because if we continue at a 9% inflation rate, obviously the value of that dollar in 10 years is not going to be equitable to what it is today. And so it's important that the tenants too, that are also mindful and thoughtful of how that transaction is put into stone today. So it's really, unfortunately, we're in this zone of uncertainty, if you will. But again, it's about giving latitude from both parties to make sure that a fair transaction can evolve through time.
Thank you for reviewing that. Very, very helpful. James, is there anything else that we should have covered with that in mind, this topic in mind, that we haven't covered that is important for our listeners to know?
I would say overall, as a broker, we are always cautiously optimistic. But I would say that no one should be hitting the panic button. Business cycles are natural. They happen. They are going to happen and continue to happen for the rest of all of our careers listening on this podcast today. And I think it's important for people to not overreact and just take the opportunity today as it is, and really, again, just be thoughtful about the other side of the table. And when people can do that, I think ultimately, fair transactions will be made. But really, again, because of where we are geographically, because of how this community was built, and when I say community, I'm meaning the Bay Area, we're going to see growth over time, and we always will. This is arguably a moment in time, and it's one where all of us are trying to adapt real time, and no one has a crystal ball. But ultimately, whether it's 12 months or 18 months, which historically a recession could last, still can't be worse than what we just went through, which was COVID. And where the world came to a complete halt. So I think now this is, again, part of the exhaust from COVID, as far as just some of the negativity and obviously fiscally how the global economy is reacting. But again, ultimately, I'm a firm believer that things will be better than they were before, and the Bay Area will continue to thrive as it always has. And I'm excited to see what happens in the next 24, 36 months.
So my final question is, are you hiring leasing brokers? How are you planning on expanding your business?
That's a great question. Growth has actually never been part of the business plan as it relates to quantity. However, we are always looking for strategic partners who share our ethos and standard. And that's one that we like to think is very high. And so when architecting the initial business plan, the focus really was around how to redefine how retail brokerage has been executed, at least in my career. And while I learned many things from many people, from many mentors who I respect, that taught me a way to do things, I also saw many things that I didn't like. And I'm focusing on both equally to create a culture here at the Econic company where people can ultimately be the best versions of themselves, whether that's personally, professionally, socially. And it's one where we continue every day to strive to provide a better service, never focusing on the fees, but our quality of execution on the day-to-day, because ultimately the results always follow when you are unwavering with that standard.
Beautifully said, and it clearly shows that you focus on quality. How
Thank
can
you.
our listeners get in touch with you, James?
Great question. They are welcome to visit our website at theeconiccompany.com, and that's all spelled out. And econic is with an E, and all of our contact information is there. And happy to field any questions or inquiries from there.
Thank you so much for coming back. And you can come back anytime, James, to share any insights you'd like to share with us. I really appreciate your time.
Grateful for the invitation. Thank you.
And if you are learning from our podcast, make sure to write us a review on the podcast app. Just click on the podcast icon and scroll down all the way to ratings and reviews. Click write a review. I would greatly appreciate it, and I will see you next time.